after you somehow managed to keep it through wars, through revolutions, through economic crashes, through changing governments, through shifting borders, through 5 centuries of history that tried, repeatedly, to take everything away. If that sounds almost impossible, that's because it is. And yet, a handful of European royal families have done exactly that. When people talk about kings and queens, they usually focus on the crowns, the palaces, the ceremonies, the scandals. But behind all of that lies a much more fascinating story. Money. Lots of it. Not the kind of money that appears overnight. Not the kind that one brilliant entrepreneur builds in a decade. We're talking about something far stranger and far older. Estates and castles, forests and farmland, art collections assembled over generations, jewels that predate modern nations, properties in cities that didn't even exist when these families first started accumulating wealth. The kind of money that doesn't just survive time, the kind that feeds on it. So today, we're asking a deceptively simple question. Who are the richest royal families in Europe? But, as we'll discover, answering that question is far more complicated than it sounds, because before we can measure royal wealth, we first need to understand what royal wealth actually is. And that, it turns out, is where things get genuinely interesting. Take Buckingham Palace, for instance, one of the most famous buildings on Earth, an address that almost everyone on the planet would recognize, a structure so associated with British royalty that for many people around the world, it is the image of the monarchy. But here's the catch. King Charles doesn't own Buckingham Palace the way you own your own house. He can't wake up tomorrow, decide he'd prefer a quieter life in the countryside, and put it on the market. He can't renovate the East Wing on a whim or lease out the ballroom for corporate events because he needs some extra cash. Buckingham Palace belongs to something called the Crown Estate, a vast collection of properties, lands, and assets that are tied to the institution of the monarchy rather than to the monarch as a private individual. The revenues it generates go to the treasury. The monarch receives a portion back, called the sovereign grant, to fund official duties. In other words, the palace is associated with the king, but it is not, in any straightforward sense, his. And this distinction matters enormously when we try to calculate royal wealth, because a significant portion of what looks like personal fortune is actually institutional property. It belongs to the crown, to the nation, to a centuries-old legal arrangement that doesn't map neatly onto modern ideas of private ownership. This is why estimating royal fortunes resembles detective work more than accounting. You're not looking at a bank statement. You're untangling centuries of inheritance law, state arrangements, private trusts, and historical agreements between dynasties and governments. Agreements made in eras when the very concept of separating a king's personal wealth from his nation's treasury barely existed. And yet, despite all those complications, some families clearly stand out. The question is, which ones and why? If I asked you to name the richest royal family in Europe, your mind would probably go to Britain first. Maybe to Monaco, if you've seen enough photographs of the harbor. Almost certainly not to a country most people couldn't locate on a map, but here is where the story gets genuinely surprising. Because the most quietly, persistently, staggeringly wealthy royal family in Europe may well be the ruling House of Liechtenstein. Close your eyes and picture Liechtenstein, if you can picture it at all. It's a tiny alpine state wedged between Switzerland and Austria. You could drive across it in about 20 minutes. Its entire population would fit comfortably inside a medium-sized American city. It has no airport. It has no army to speak of. It produces almost nothing that makes international headlines. And the princely house of Liechtenstein may be worth somewhere in the region of $4 to $5 billion. How? The answer reveals something important about how old money actually works. Unlike many royal families who gradually became ceremonial figures supported by state budgets, the House of Liechtenstein never fully made that transition. They remained, in a very real sense, an operating family enterprise. They own LGT Group, one of the world's largest private banking and asset management firms. They hold vast art collections, one of the most significant private collections in the world, assembled over 4 centuries. They own agricultural land, forests, and real estate across Austria, the Czech Republic, and beyond. Think about that geography for a moment. Much of the land the Liechtenstein family owns today lies in countries that have changed names, governments, and political systems multiple times since the family first acquired it. Empires rose and fell around their estates, and the estates remained. They didn't just inherit wealth. They managed it, they grew it, they moved it into modern financial structures while keeping the historical assets intact. In many ways, the princes of Liechtenstein behaved less like medieval royalty and more like a family-run multinational enterprise that happened to also have a country attached to it. And that distinction is everything. Now let's talk about Britain, because we have to. When people imagine royal wealth, the British royal family dominates the picture, and it's not hard to see why. The palaces, not just Buckingham, but Windsor Castle, Sandringham, Balmoral, the Palace of Holyrood House, the crown jewels, which include gems of a size and historical significance that are genuinely irreplaceable, the art collection, which spans old masters, royal portraits, and objects accumulated from 4 centuries of empire, the Duchy of Cornwall, the Duchy of Lancaster. The sheer visible accumulation of it is staggering, but when analysts actually try to separate what King Charles personally controls from what belongs to the institution of the crown, a more complicated picture emerges. The crown jewels cannot be sold. The royal palaces are not his to dispose of. Much of what looks like private wealth is actually held in a trust for future monarchs, tied to the crown rather than to the individual wearing it. What Charles does personally own is still considerable. Estimates of his private wealth run into the hundreds of millions. His personal property portfolio, his art, his private investments, those are genuinely his, passed down through carefully structured inheritances. But it's a different order of magnitude from the institutional assets that surround him. This gap between image and reality is one of the most persistent misunderstandings about British royal wealth. The family lives inside one of the most expensive accumulations of property and treasure in human history. They just don't own most of it in the way the word own is usually understood. And perhaps that arrangement is itself a form of genius. Because assets held by institutions are far harder to seize, tax, or redistribute than assets held by individuals. They exist in a kind of protected legal space, shielded from the changes in government and public opinion that would otherwise threaten them. The British monarchy doesn't just preserve wealth, it's architectured the structure of that wealth to make it almost indestructible. Beyond Britain and Liechtenstein, a handful of other royal families deserve attention. Not always for the size of their wealth, but for the strategies that preserved it. Monaco is the obvious one. The Grimaldi family has ruled Monaco since the 13th century, one of the longest unbroken ruling dynasties in European history, and they have governed a territory so small you could walk across it in an afternoon. But that tiny territory sits on some of the most expensive real estate on Earth, the harbor filled with super yachts, the casino that gives the entire principality a kind of mythological glamour, the tax arrangements that have attracted fortunes from across the globe for decades. Prince Albert II of Monaco is regularly cited as one of the wealthiest monarchs in the world. His personal fortune, separate from the state's assets, is estimated in the hundreds of millions. In a country where the GDP per capita is among the highest anywhere, and where the ruling family maintains direct involvement in economic life, the lines between personal wealth and national prosperity blur in ways that benefit the Grimaldis considerably. Then there is Luxembourg, another small country, another ruling family that rarely makes international headlines but has quietly positioned itself at the center of European finance for generations. The Grand Ducal family of Luxembourg has benefited from a combination of political stability, geographic luck, and shrewd management of the country's role in European institutions. Luxembourg became a financial hub. It became a center of European Union administration, and the ruling family, while operating as a constitutional monarchy with limited political power, moved through those decades with their assets largely intact. And in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the royal families represent a different model entirely. Their personal wealth is more modest than Liechtenstein or Monaco. They operate on civil lists and state grants. They don't run private banks or own vast art collections. But they have preserved something perhaps more valuable than money: public legitimacy, deep, stable, multi-generational trust from their populations. And in the long run, that may be the most durable asset of all. So, who are the richest royal families in Europe? By raw estimates of private wealth, Liechtenstein almost certainly leads, followed by Monaco, with the royal British family holding institutional assets that dwarf everyone else, even if Charles's personal fortune is more modest than the palaces suggest. But here's what I think is the more interesting answer. The richest royal families in Europe are not simply the ones with the biggest numbers. They are the families that figured out something far more difficult than accumulating wealth. They figured out how to keep it. History is full of aristocratic families that had more. Russian nobles before the revolution held fortunes that make today's royal estimates look modest. German princely houses once owned territories larger than some modern countries. French aristocrats accumulated riches across the centuries of royal patronage. Most of them lost everything. The difference between those who lost and those who kept comes down to one word: adaptation. The surviving royal families understood that the world was changing, that absolute power was becoming a liability rather than an asset, that visibility without accountability was dangerous, that the old justifications for royal privilege, divine right, military conquest, inherited dominance no longer worked in democratic societies. So they changed. They became constitutional monarchies. They accepted limits on their power. They cultivated public relevance through ceremony and symbolism rather than through control. And quietly, carefully, often invisibly, they restructured their wealth into forms that could survive republics, revolutions, and reform. They moved money into private banks, family trusts, art institutions, and land holdings structured to outlast any individual political moment. They became, in a very real sense, the world's oldest and most successful family offices. Not because they were smarter than everyone else, not because history was kinder to them, but because they understood something that most people and most institutions never learn in time. The goal is not to dominate the present. The goal is to still be here in 100 years. And when you look at a family that has been managing that calculation since the 15th century, you start to realize that the most impressive thing about royal wealth has never been its size. It's its age.